Hi, welcome to Firepower and Firepower Threat Defense. In this section, we're going to cover the main policy, access control policy, the main policy. Let's take a look at our FMC we've been using, and we can see that we don't have any data because we didn't ever really create an access control policy, and there's no data coming through. In other words, we couldn't get to our inside host. We need to do our access control policy. We need to do our pre-filter, and we still need to do NAT. So those are going to be the three sections we're doing now right in a row. So the first thing we want to do is come out here to policies. And now this is the policy we created here we had to create a policy when we brought in our devices. And I've applied both of them in here. Once you come into the policy, you click on the assignments so you can take them or add them to the policy from here. But there's a couple things here. First off, we have these tabs here. Now, we've seen this a little bit, especially if you've watched the object section. That goes hand in hand here. Objects are very important. Let me open that back up, as a matter of fact. So we'll stay here, and then as we go through these tabs, which we'll do before the rules, we'll use our objects. So in this case here, this is where we create the rules. Now, as a file comes in or a packet comes in, if you're running FTD, which we are, we're going to hit the pre-filter first, and that's in the Lena process. Then we'll get through security intelligence, right? So it's the first thing it hits in the snort process, is security intelligence. So let's take a look. So inside here, if I had added my objects in the past, I need to re-add them, but I must have taken them out for a reason. But what I want to do is I'm going to see the default object. So if I come up here to objects here, here's the defaults. We cannot delete these. We cannot do anything with them, edit them. We can only add to them, and of course I have some in here when we did the object section. But if we come back here to the ACP, we could use these now for a rule. That's what we're trying to do. Now, as you're aware, again, I went into detail on security intelligence in the objects, but we're going to talk about this some more. There's some lists that are enabled by default. So these would block bad guys, bad IPs is layer 3, and over here is going to be by layer 7. And of course, we also had our layer 7 DNS in here that we added when I was in objects. We're going to go through the DNS policy as a separate section, but we added those objects in there just so we can add the Cisco objects in here. Now, so these are my layer 7 here. This is my layer 3. Now, what's in these right here? Well, let's take a look at a couple things. So if I come out here to my website and go back to my blog, I have an entry in there on how to see them. And if you went through the object section again, you would see that, so I'm going to click blog here, you would see that one of the things I talked about is how to download those IPs. So here it is right here, how to find the list of IP, URL, and DNS entries. Now, the IP one's easy, right? We just go out to Talos, and it's there. We can download that easily. But it's not the same for the URL and DNS. What is in those? So in this blog, it shows you have to go through the CLI of the FMC or an FTD box after it's been deployed, and you'll be able to type in some commands to see it, and that's what this discusses. Okay, now, in this sense here, I want to come down here to security intelligence. So here's my layer 3 and my layer 7 security intelligence. So security intelligence feed, I think we had changed it to every 30 minutes, right? The default is 2 hours. I usually don't go less than 30 minutes because you might, if you're trying to deploy and there's doing an update, then it won't deploy. It says can't deploy, update in progress. And if you're at 5 minutes, it's pretty much all the time. So I usually leave it at 30 minutes, but I lower it from 2 hours. We're getting our money's worth for our license. We pay a lot of money, and it's just a base license, right? Under the DNS lists and feed, there's the white and black list under URLs, but under DNS, we have the intelligence feed for the DNS URL objects, and that is 2 hours by default. We can set that down to only 30 minutes at the lowest. Now, in the network lists and feeds here, notice I added that new list in here, which now shows up right there, my new blacklist. And now I could add that into my blacklist. I typically would add all the Cisco ones, and I kind of suggest that you do this. Now, if you are worried that these might drop good traffic, which is unlikely, But nonetheless, if you just can't drop data, then you could come over here and say, I want you to be monitor only. I want you to be monitor only. And same with like this one, right? I usually do these in class because it allows me to get some attacks through, because security intelligence is so good. Sometimes you're not going to see any snort events. All right. Now, in this case here, I've got my global blacklist and I've got my whitelist. So what's the whitelist for? The whitelist, so if I come back here and here's the objects that I made, and I made my also important enterprise object. If I add that into the blacklist accidentally, and people do this all the time, they don't necessarily use that object, but what they do is when we get to the network analysis section, you're going to see that I blacklist a lot of hosts. And it's really easy to just see an attacked host or a host that's attacking and blacklist it, sometimes without paying attention because you're in a hurry, and you end up blacklisting an internal server, for example, like the email server I see here a lot. Now, if that's the case, we could say, here's my object. What I would do, though, is add this enterprise object to the whitelist. Why? Well, if we look over here, we can see that this got a line through it because the whitelist exists only to override the blacklist. Whitelist exists only to override the blacklist. And in this case, this is kind of important because if you accidentally blacklist something on your inside, then it wouldn't be blacklisted, right? That's why we would use the whitelist. So be careful about understanding this whitelist, because I get a lot of people going, well, we added something to the whitelist, now it doesn't get through. It doesn't mean anything. The whitelist only says I'm going to override the blacklist. I'm not going to kill the packet now. I very well may kill the packet later, right? In the ACP rules, for example. But in this case here, I'm just not going to kill it right now. That's all this says, is I can't be killed by the blacklist. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my URLs, and I added the D, and I'm going to add all these in here. And I could do things like monitor these. I don't suggest making these monitor in production. They're really bad guys that are in here, right? And Cisco updates these constantly, right? And we're having them update every 30 minutes is what we're doing. All right, so on the DNS, I added them in that, and we'll look at that again when we get to the DNS policy. But if you wanted to see what I did there, you can go to the objects section, objects video. Now, there's some couple other tabs here, and HTTP responses. Some of my customers don't do this or don't use Firepower for blocking URLs, for example. In this case here, if someone's going out to a site, Facebook is a good example, and the company wants to block Facebook, what we could do is give them a response. If we give them none, they get a 404 error. Then that's not a very good customer experience or employee experience. But the second thing is that they're going to call you probably. So I'm going to create a custom one, and the first thing I'm going to do is take out this consult your system administrator for details. Right? You're attempting to. You want them not to call you, so here's what you do. You're fired, right? Gather your personal belongings and meet security at the front door, something like that. They're not going to call you. They're going to do it. I can't get any of my customers to type this in, but you can get an idea that when they go to a site that we're blocking via URL, some sort of HTTP or HTTPS, then we want to give them some sort of message like, this is not a work site, something like that. The fired one does work in the sense of making them not call you. Interactive block. And what this does is a way to do this. There's a couple ways to do this, but basically by default, I can come up into a rule and create an interactive block rule, which says you can go there, but only for 10 minutes by default. And we'll change that in the advanced tab in a minute. But I'm going to come down here to custom. It says you're intending to access forbidden site. You may continue clicking the button below. Blah, blah, blah. We don't need all this stuff in here, but I'm going to say, but we're watching you, right? Because we're logging it. And now nothing would stop them from hitting that again and resetting it for 10 minutes other than a log, right? So just letting them know, hey, they're going out to a non-work site. If you still need to go, this is very helpful. I was out at a customer and I needed to get to an external mail. It was very important, and they had that. They said, you can go there, but it's not a work site. And I thought, well, that was really nice because I really needed to go there. So custom is what I do. You really want to set these if you're using some sort of URL block rules, right? Now, the advanced tab is pretty advanced, actually. First off, we have the general setting. Let's take a look at these. Maximum URL characters, 1024 seems like a lot of characters, doesn't it? Not really, I guess. There's some long ones, but interactive block right here. So here's my interactive block time. So I'm going to take that and say everyone gets 15 minutes break, right? So there's your 15 minutes now. Now the URL cache miss lookup, if we're going to go ahead and if Cisco doesn't understand the URL, we're gonna look that up, security intelligence, right? And so there's no reason either one of these they shouldn't even really be options. In 623 code, they actually changed the words here. Before that, the wording that they had in there had made no sense and had nothing to do with this checkbox. But what this says is we're going to inspect traffic during pulse play. We're going to allow us to send out, and I'll show you this when we go to deploy. We're going to go ahead and say, okay, we have to restart snort. So if you do something that change a file policy, IPS policy, security intelligence, whatever, and it has to restart the snort process, then what it's going to say is, hey, when we do that, it's depending on your device, we're going to drop a couple packets. Probably. You can test this by starting a ping and then hitting a deploy and see what happens. If you have a 4150, 9300, you probably won't notice it at all. Or even a Cisco appliance, the 8200s, 8500s, I think they are. They're so fast that they can do a policy push without much of a problem. But if you had a 5506, right, run as FTD as we do in these classes, then you're going to see a possible interruption. Might not be a big deal, but leave these alone. It's going to tell you, because if you check this off, it says, well, I'm not gonna be able to do this. I'm going to do it without inspection, right? So we don't want to do that. In other words, we'll let traffic through without being inspected. In this case here, we're going to say, no, we're going to hold it until we can inspect it while the file's being copied to the FTD box or deployed on the FTD box. Now, so if we look under policies here, notice we have these other policies. There's 7 listed here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here, and the 7th being access controls policy. These 6 go into the access control policy, but the 7th policy is something called the network analysis policy, and we'll get to that section. They actually kind of hide it because they don't want you screwing with it, because you might not see attacks if you don't tell it how to build the files correctly so they can be inspected by snort, and that's what the NAP does. It's snort preprocessors. So that actually is the 7th policy that goes in the ACP. So these are not pushed out by themselves. They're all put in the ACP and pushed out, but where? That's a good question here. Well, first off, under security intelligence, this is where my DNS policy is implemented inside the ACP, inside security intelligence tab. In the advanced tab, we have them right here: identity policy, SSL, pre-filter, and then here's my NAP. This is where I set my network analysis policy. Now, they have a couple quick links up here, and of course not for the NAP. The pre-filter, SSL, and identity, all it does is take you here. It was quickly because everyone's like, where do I set these? Where do I set these, right? Now, we'll come over on the right-hand side. What these are for is preprocessor performance settings. When we get to the IPS section, we're going to do a really heavy section on IPS and snort. And one of the things you can do is turn on a lot of snort rules that have very high overhead and cause some performance issues. So that's what these are for. We don't really need to change these, but you can. It depends on what rules you turn on, and we'll get to these when we do snort and the network analysis policy. Now, under here is where now this is an interesting one right here. Intrusion policy used before access control rule is determined. Well, I'm going to turn this off because this will definitely by default drop traffic. And you might get a snort event, but you're not going to get a connection event from here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this off by doing no rules active. So let's talk about what this means. If your packet is being compared down to some rules, and you have a lot of rules, and it comes up to a rule that says, hey, go look at this AD and see if it's part of this group. It matches, this rule. It's going to take some time, 100, 200 milliseconds, whatever. And what they said is, hey, that's a lot of time. Let's run a snort policy on that packet or packets, right? And so that's what this does. Say if you're looking up geolocation or something that takes a little bit of time to see if it matches, then this is going to run an IPS policy at that time. The variable set here, absolutely, I'm going to change my variable set here to be the one that I created, my default. And then we'll talk about the NAP here later. Now, it says no access control rules are configured. So anytime you change something in ACP until you configure it, then it's going to give you this warning, right? Now, the files and malware settings, what this is going to do is limit the number of bytes. Like we could change some stuff. So basically, we're going to determine the file type, with the first packet. That's what that says, right? We don't look at the extension, right? We look at the packet to determine what is a PDF, exe, and so on. Now check this out. So if I'm getting some packets in, and they match the file policy that's implemented through the ACP here, and those are implemented through the rules, right? So we talked about pre-filter SS identity in the advanced tab, DNS, and security intelligence. Malware file and intrusion are implemented in a rule. Now, that being said, if some packets match that rule in that file policy, it's going to build that file, calculate the SHA, and send that to the AMP cloud, assuming that's what you configured it for. Now, if it takes longer than 2 seconds, which is an eternity, right? It's a long time, about 10 times what it needs. Because all it's doing is sending the SHA there and getting the disposition back to the FMC. Now, this is something that the host does not do by itself. The host will send the SHA to the FMC for disposition. If it doesn't have it, it's going to send it to the AMP cloud to get a disposition. All right. So the FTD boxes or Firepower in itself does not talk to the AMP cloud. Now, if you have AMP for endpoint, those can talk to the AMP cloud to itself, but not this. So if it takes more than 2 seconds, we're going to let the file go. Right? So maybe you let the file, I've seen it where a file comes in one time and it goes through, the next time not, because it's calculated and figured out it was malware. We're also not going to calculate SHA hash values for files larger than 10 megs. 2 reasons. Latency, the time it takes to calculate the SHA is a long time on a 10 meg file. The other thing is malware comes in pretty small packages. It's unlikely someone's going to email you a 10 meg file to give you malware. But nonetheless, it's probably more the latency at this point. Our size and storing files. If we store the file, if we choose that in our file policy, hey, store the file, store malware, whatever. And then the file size to send it up to Talos, where we send the file, not the SHA, into a sandbox. And the last one, intelligent application bypass. Don't get confused with the automatic application bypass, AAB, that we set in the devices. This is for apps and application filters. Now, in this case here, we'll come back to the rest. I can save this. I don't need to, but I'm going to go ahead and save this just so I have it. Anything that I change, which isn't much.